everybody. Ahmed Susi here, the Interim Executive Director of CAIR Arizona, and welcome to our second Know Your Rights event. I'm excited for this Know Your Rights event just because, to me, housing rights are so important, and today we're going to be talking about fair housing. But just like the last Know Your Rights presentation, we are not alone. We are joined with members from the Southwest Fair Housing Coalition. I am excited to be here with Ms. Laura Leyva and Ms. Tasha Lynch. How are you both doing?
Doing good, thank you.
And I apologize. It was coalition or association? Did I?
It's the Southwest Fair Housing Council.
My apologies.
No worries.
My apologies. But so you guys are located in Tucson, but you serve the whole state, correct?
Correct.
And I know we're going to talk about it in the presentation, but can you tell us a little bit about your organization?
Yeah, for sure. So here at the Southwest Fair Housing Council, our mission is to end housing discrimination and to achieve and preserve equal access to housing for all people. We do that in a couple of different ways. At this moment in time, we are doing all of our services remotely. So what we're doing today, providing some education and outreach and our enforcement services as well. But pretty much in a nutshell, we provide enforcement and education to the public as well, but our goal is to really put an end to housing discrimination across the state of Arizona.
Awesome. Well, I'll save my questions for the end. You guys have a presentation if you'd like to put it up.
Cool, yeah, and I do have Tasha here today. She's a member of enforcement, so she'll be answering any questions that we have kind of as we go through the presentation. So let me just share my screen. And I'm so sorry if anybody can hear my dog snoring in the background. He's
no problem.
A little bit older. All right, so like I said, we are the Southwest Fair Housing Council. I'm an education and outreach specialist at the organization, and Tasha's an enforcement member. Our mission is to provide comprehensive services to achieve and preserve equal access to housing for all people. And that's a mission that gets accomplished in a couple of different ways. One of those ways is through providing education to the public. A main thing that we do, we provide fair housing classes to both consumers and providers as well, because both need to know their rights and their responsibilities under the Act, because there are protections there. So we work with a lot of different partnering organizations across Arizona. Currently, since we are working remotely, we have been able to really expand our education to more consumers, because it kind of became the norm with COVID that you can enter a webinar pretty quickly. So it's been kind of nice in that way, but we do look forward to kind of being able to gather with more individuals in public. So the other portion of what we do in order to achieve our mission is through enforcement, meaning we respond to calls of illegal housing discrimination, and we provide investigative services to individuals free of cost. And once again, we do cover the entire state of Arizona. So even though we're physically located in Tucson, well, some of us are, we do serve the entire state. So the Federal Fair Housing Act, it is a federal law that prohibits unlawful discrimination in all aspects, including, but it's not limited to rental leasing, sales, mortgage, appraisals, design and construction, and even things like zoning. And even if the Fair Housing Act doesn't apply to somebody's individual property, there could still be some local regulations that do apply, or some additional protections on a local level that could potentially impact them, even if the Federal Fair Housing Act doesn't necessarily cover them. So that is kind of what we run our organization on. We are defending the Fair Housing Act. We are upholding the promise of the Fair Housing Act, which is to, create inclusive communities where everybody's made to feel welcome. So there are a few exemptions to the Federal Fair Housing Act. So single-family homes rented without the use of a real estate agent are exempt from the Federal Fair Housing Act, as long as a private landlord/owner doesn't own more than 3 homes at a time. Apartments of 4 units or less are also exempt if the owner lives in one of these units. But even if this multifamily exemption applies, there could still be some local protections that actually change that a little bit. So it just depends pretty much exactly where you live. So other exemptions will include the rental of a single room in a home, qualified senior housing, and housing operated by religious or private organizations, but they do have to meet very specific requirements. But once again, not to repeat myself a million times, but regardless of any federal exemptions, there are still a lot of local and state jurisdictions that have their own fair housing laws, often with additional protected classes or different exemptions. So it's important to always be aware. So fair housing is the right to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination. Federal, state, and even local fair housing laws protect people from discrimination in housing transactions. And these laws and protections basically help to ensure that everybody has equal and safe access to housing. So, and this is a presentation that we typically take a little bit longer. You know, we do have our Fair Housing Basics class that we provide, and we do have a calendar on our website that I'll also share where we go even more in depth on each protected class. But for the sake of time, and you know, this is a general overview of what we do as an organization. So I did want to point that out. So it is also important to know that housing discrimination, discrimination in itself is defined as the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things. But housing discrimination specifically refers to patterns of discrimination that can affect the person's ability to rent or buy housing. So accessing housing. This disparate treatment of a person on the housing market can be based on the 7 protected characteristics and our local ordinances where the person lives. So the 7 protected classes are as follows. So the 7 protected classes, any member of any of these, they are protected against illegal housing discrimination. So the Federal Fair Housing Act protects individuals that belong to any of these protected classes from illegal discrimination. And those include disability, race, color, national origin, sex, familial status, and religion as well. And depending on where you live in the US, there may be additional local ordinances that can also apply. So a good example would be the city of Tucson. There are additional protections to the Fair Housing Act in the city of Tucson and the city of Phoenix as well. So the city of Tucson and the city of Phoenix, and I believe Tempe and Scottsdale and Mesa as well, they also protect individuals based on sexual orientation, gender identity, as well as age, ancestry, and marital status. So there are those additional local protections, but it really just depends on where an individual lives. But if you find yourself in the city of Tucson or the city of Phoenix, those are absolutely additional protections there. So the other part of what we do in order to, really achieve our mission and really, really do what we are setting out to do, which is to end housing discrimination, is called testing. This falls under this category of something that we call affirmatively furthering fair housing, which means that as a fair housing organization, our goal is to consistently further fair housing. We don't want to just do the same thing all the time. We are taking all these steps, very meaningful steps, to really achieve those missions and really further fair housing in itself. One of those ways is through something that we call testing. So this actually was set in place in 1991 when the Civil Rights Division established a fair housing testing program within the Housing and Civil Enforcement section and commenced testing in 1992. I like to think that this is like one of the more exciting things that we do. Enforcement is pretty cool, but testing is even cooler in my opinion.
I'm with you.
Yeah. So testing refers to the use of individuals who, without any bona fide intent to rent or purchase a home, apartment, or any other dwelling, pose as a prospective buyer or renter of the real estate for the purpose of gathering information. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation that in order for something to be housing discrimination, there does need to be a pattern. So patterns do need to exist in order for housing discrimination to be proven. So testing is one of those ways that we can really uncover those patterns. So this information is gathered so that we can indicate whether a housing provider is complying with fair housing laws or not. So testers are not just sent randomly. Somebody once told me that, they made it a comparison to like a secret shopper. And I'm like, well, those came randomly. I used to work at a grocery store and they would just come in, whenever. But that's not really how testing works. Testing is very meaningful and it's very calculated. So it's usually, to gather information, basically. That's what we use it for. And, on that note, if any individual is interested in really taking part and, taking meaningful action in the process of fair housing, we are always recruiting fair housing testers as well. So I'll provide more information on our website for that as well. Cool. So I always repeat my slide because I think one of the most important things that we need to acknowledge when we're talking about fair housing, because the Fair Housing Act is very complicated. It's very extensive. There's a lot to be talked about. There's a lot of nuisances, but we do need to remember the 7 protected classes at the very least. So the Fair Housing Act protects individuals that belong to any of these 7 protected classes from illegal housing discrimination. So disability, race, color, national origin, sex, familial status, and religion. In a regular fair housing class that we are offering even remotely at the moment, we do tend to dissect each and every protected class. So, if anybody's ever interested in one of those classes, we provide them free of charge to the public as well.
And I'll put in the description your guys' website. So if anyone wants to get involved in the class or become a tester, they'll have that resource.
Awesome. Yes, definitely. So I did like to point out some examples. I think that sometimes when we talk about housing discrimination, it's hard to see a bigger picture. It's hard to see specific examples beyond just somebody mistreating an individual. But, fair housing is something that is just so relevant even in our time today. And I think that although 2020 kind of changed this a little bit, 2021 has really shown us already just in these few months that there is still a lot of work to be done, that instances of discrimination are still occurring everywhere. Furthermore, the pandemic has really shown us that housing, and access to housing and housing stability can really dictate not only our level of opportunity, but, our health as well and the health of our families as well. So it's even more important right now to be aware of these things and to be aware that we do have rights and that there are responsibilities that need to be followed by providers as well. So a good example, just to kind of bring some context to what we're talking about when we talk about fair housing, is a victory from back in 2017 of the US versus the town of Colorado City, Arizona. So the town of Colorado City, Arizona, it's kind of like on the border of Utah and Arizona. And this is one of the bigger cases of fair housing. And it's always interesting to me because prior to working with fair housing, I had no idea that this had happened, even though it's such it's a huge victory, but B, it was just so egregious that it's interesting to think that something like this was happening. So on April 18, 2017, the Court of the U.S. versus the town of Colorado City and Hilldale adopted the jury's findings that the town of Colorado City and the city of Hilldale engaged in decades-long patterns and practices of police misconduct and housing discrimination. So the order complaint determined discrimination based on religion in violation of the Fair Housing Act, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, and Title III of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So to put it very briefly, in the town of Colorado City, the goal of not only certain individuals in the town of Colorado City, but the goal of just, the entire local jurisdiction as well, was to essentially keep individuals out that did not follow the strict religion that they were specifically following. And this is one of those things where I would assume that any individual that is experiencing this would have had a hard time identifying what was actually happening or that it was really happening to them. But, the steps and the measures that were taken in order to keep individuals out were incredibly egregious. And looking at it now, it was things like cutting off services in order for them to, to leave essentially, if they even managed to acquire housing in the first place, right? So it was things like that. The police was involved as well. There were enforcements of different things that should not have been enforced, all with this common goal of keeping individuals out that were not willing to follow the same religion. And obviously, we cannot keep individuals out because they're not following the same religion. They were protected on that, on that protected class from the Fair Housing Act. And once again, it's something that is just so egregious when you look at it in paper, but as it is happening, it's really difficult to identify. And I think that's important to mention because with housing discrimination, it can be really difficult for, the average consumer, somebody that is not necessarily working with fair housing or has a deeper knowledge of it, to really identify what is actually happening. So that is why we're here, to really educate the public on these instances, educate the public to be aware of their rights and their responsibilities so that we can put a stop if we see any instances of illegal housing discrimination occurring. But I always like to talk about cases. I think it really puts into perspective, just how important it is and how much it actually happens. And even though we've made all these strides, right, towards ending housing discrimination, it is still something that happens. And it's important to uncover it, and it's important to speak up about it so that we can actually put an end to it.
One thing that I appreciate real quick is that you brought a case that's only a couple years old. Like you just said, I think some of us think, when Martin Luther King gave his speech and Civil Rights Act, like you said, everything cleaned up. But we just saw right here a case 2017 that was uncovered. And I mean, just seeing a recent example is good. So I'm happy that you put that there.
Yeah, for sure. And in my regular, just class that I do, that's about an hour and a half long, I talk about a few more that are actually from 2019. So it's, yeah, I mean, it's always
Uphill
interesting.
battle.
Yeah, it definitely is. But, seeing those victories does,
Yeah.
it does give us motivation and hope that things are happening and things are moving. So there are 8 prohibited practices, and it is illegal discrimination to take any of the following actions because of any of the 7 protected classes or any of the additional protected classes that may be added to local ordinances as well. So number 1 is refusing to rent or sell or to negotiate for the rental or sale of a dwelling. Number 2 is subjecting persons to different terms, conditions, and privileges. Number 3 is limiting housing choice by word or conduct. Number 4 is otherwise making housing unavailable in any way. Number 5 is misrepresenting the availability of a dwelling. Number 6 is making, printing, or publishing discriminatory ads or notices. I did mention in the beginning that something like advertising is also protected by the Fair Housing Act. Number 7 is discriminating on the basis of disability. And number 8, finally, is retaliation. Yeah, so here's my slide again of the 7 protected classes, just so nobody forgets. Disability, race, color, national origin, sex, familial status, and religion. Depending on where you find yourself in Arizona or any other state, there may also be additional local protections that protect you as well. So I'm not gonna, well, we can talk a little bit about fair housing amid a global pandemic as well. So in times of crisis, the worst aspects of society can oftentimes be displayed. Since the COVID-19 virus began spread, there have been reports of increased discrimination against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And I think we are finding that it's against even more people as well, based on their national origin or perceived national origin. And we have seen irrational acts of xenophobia. We know from decades of experience that in times of crisis, women are actually particularly susceptible to acts of sexual harassment from providers and other housing and financial services providers. So the reason that I mentioned that is, amid any sort of financial crisis, there are increased numbers of discrimination that go on for many different reasons. I think specifically the COVID-19 virus has, really increased those acts of xenophobia that are irrational and everything. So it's important to note that, a pandemic or a virus that is still, very much unknown to a lot of us, it is not an excuse for illegal housing discrimination. Having something be unknown, not necessarily knowing what is going on, it is not an excuse to discriminate against individuals. And as consumers and just as regular individuals trying to access housing, it's important to note that, there are no changes to the way that you should be treated and to the protections of the Fair Housing Act just because of a global pandemic. We have all these moratoriums, everything going on, but what remains is that it is still not okay to discriminate against individuals based on these baseless perceptions or assumptions or stereotypes. So it's just something I like to mention specifically now. We do have a COVID-19 and fair housing class that goes a little bit more in depth into, how the pandemic has really impacted fair housing. So when we share a calendar, you're able to sign up for those. We do provide those on a weekly basis, and we do try to update it as much as we can. We also have our COVID-19 resource page up on our website. So that is just, it was our response to the pandemic. We really wanted to, provide individuals with as many resources as we could compile. So even though not all of them are necessarily related to, the Fair Housing Act, they're still important for our consumers to have. So our COVID-19 resource page, it's updated daily with the most current information and as many resources as we can actually, really get in the state of Arizona. So if individuals are interested in that, it's up on our website as well.
For the moratorium, I know of examples of people not knowing that their landlord couldn't evict them, and we didn't get complaints, but other organizations were telling us about how they were getting complaints about that stuff. And it's like you said, education is the key to this stuff. Not everyone's going to be knowing every single right they have, especially if they're not tuned in or they got other issues like the pandemic taking their life, stressing them. So even though we have these protections, once again, I appreciate organizations like you that have resources so people could at least try to know what their rights are. But half the thing is making sure they know about organizations like you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And, going back on the eviction moratorium and everything, it may not necessarily be related to housing discrimination, but at the end of the day, it's still important for, the individuals that we serve to be aware of that. So that's why we really wanted to make it a point to share all of these resources and as many as we possibly can that are related to housing, even if they're not necessarily related to, our day-to-day work that we do in the organization. So on that page, we do share some legal resources for individuals and some legal contacts that they can, get in touch with to help them out. And I did try to share the CDC, basically the paperwork that an individual has to share with their landlord in order to be protected under the eviction moratorium. So things like that, we do like to share there. And if individuals have any questions, we really have no problem trying to answer those questions or referring them to somebody that may have, better expertise regarding, landlord tenant rights. So, yeah. So moving forward a little bit from, what we do, if an individual is experiencing housing discrimination or they believe that they have experienced housing discrimination, they have witnessed housing discrimination, or, somebody they know is experiencing housing discrimination, we do encourage them to call us and to potentially submit a complaint. So there's a couple of different things that individuals can do. Really, a regular individual can go onto the HUD website and submit a fair housing complaint if they really want to. However, we have found through research that individuals are about 7 times more likely to, come to a positive resolution with their complaint if they work with a fair housing organization such as us. And I didn't mention at the beginning that we're actually the only fair housing organization in the state of Arizona. And all of our services are free of charge to individuals. So, we really encourage them to work with somebody like us as opposed to trying to tackle on this process, which tends to be very, it's very tedious and there's a lot of nuisances. There's a lot of misunderstandings about what discrimination actually is. So when they work with somebody like us, and, we're people that have been doing this work for many, many years, they are more likely to get a positive resolution in their complaint. So that's something.
One of the nice things about that is in our employment discrimination know your rights presentation, we talked about how you have to first file a complaint with the EEOC, and there we said you don't have to have an attorney there, but you still have to do that process. Like you said, your organization can assist with people filing complaints. I mean, obviously we're here as well, but that's one of the nice things about reaching out to a fair housing organization is even if you guys don't have the resources or whatever, at least you'll be able to put them in a better foot. With the EEOC, either you talk to an attorney, you might have to pay for that, or you might just have to risk it by yourself. And those are one of the differences with HUD, I guess, and how many resources there are with housing and how many they're not for employment discrimination.
Yeah, and that's actually really interesting to hear it and not know that. So, I mean, it makes me even more glad that, we are able to provide this resource to individuals as much as we can. So in order to submit a complaint, first and foremost, you must file your complaint within 1 year of the last date of the alleged discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. That is important to note. Individuals do have a year to file. You are able to file a case in federal court 2 years after the last date of the alleged discrimination, but it gets a little bit more complicated when you're talking about moving directly to federal court there. Individuals can file a complaint via HUD.gov through their state attorney general or by hiring their own attorney. Individuals are free to do that. If somebody's experiencing housing discrimination and they just want to go directly through HUD.gov, you can do that. Or you can also call your attorney general in the state in where you live, or you can even hire your own attorney. But, once again, we get to this we get to this point where it just starts getting a little bit more complicated. And the reality is that, the average consumer or the average individual experiencing this does need guidance. They do need that assistance, and that's what we're here for. And once again, if they do work with us, they are more likely to get that positive resolution. So, say an individual did not want to go through HUD.gov, they did not want to call their attorney general, or they are not able to hire their own attorney, which it's a very common thing. Who's able to hire an attorney just like on the fly. So you can contact SWFHC at 520-798-1568 and press option 3 for intake. So when you press option 3 for intake, it'll either prompt you to leave a message, and our intake specialist will call the individual. And then, they'll have a conversation. We'll try to identify whether the situation is something related to the Fair Housing Act, whether the situation is a landlord-tenant related issue, and refer individuals to the proper entities if the question is, not necessarily an instance of housing discrimination. That's why we have an intake specialist. They have that conversation with individuals. And if we do determine whether the complaint is applicable, then we'll refer those that, if the complaint is applicable, then we'll take them on to intake, and we'll begin our investigation there. So once again, if an individual didn't necessarily have something related to housing discrimination or to the Fair Housing Act, which happens, right? Once again, there's a lot of nuisances, there's a lot of confusion with the Fair Housing Act, and the Landlord-Tenant Act, that even though they feed off of each other, they're not necessarily the same thing. We will refer these individuals to the proper entities if that's the case. So we're not just like, no, we can't help you. We will always refer individuals to the proper resources whenever we need to. So after intake, SWFHC, or the Southwest Fair Housing Council, will conduct an investigation, and if applicable, we will submit a complaint to HUD. So that's just kind of like where the process takes us. Individuals are also able to submit a form via our website, or they can even email a brief description of the complaint and contact information to intake@swfhc.com. Basically, whatever the individual is more comfortable with. We are checking all of these things. We are working remotely right now, but I mean, in a big way, since we provide our services to everybody across the state of Arizona, we've always done it this way. We've always been able to take calls, emails, form submissions through our website. Whatever way is best for the individual, we've always been able to accommodate that, and we try our best to accommodate as much as we can. So yeah, if an individual does feel that they have been a victim of housing discrimination, they witness housing discrimination happening to somebody else, they witness discriminatory practices happening, if they want to give us a call, they can. We'll provide them with our intake process. But it's also important to note, if somebody has a question, they are under no obligation to follow through with everything. If they just had a question, I do understand, and we do understand, that there's always a lot of fears of many different things when it comes to housing specifically. So we do understand that if individuals just happen to have a question, they can call us. They are under no obligation, but ultimately we encourage individuals to follow through with their complaints, because we cannot make these changes happen. We cannot, put an end to housing discrimination. And we cannot, end that for anybody else that may also be experiencing that discrimination along with them. We cannot do any of those things if we do not follow through with the process. So, although we are very understanding of all these different situations, I do want to point out that it's really crucial for individuals to follow through. So then what to expect when somebody submits a complaint or, begins the process. When an individual reports possible discrimination, HUD will check whether a formal complaint can be filed under fair housing laws and enforced by HUD. It's the same thing that we do. If somebody's reporting possible discrimination, we'll try to assess the situation and make sure that whether we should file a formal complaint, we kind of assess the situation to the best of our advantage. And then if necessary, we'll provide them with whatever advice they may need. Sometimes individuals are not necessarily needing, to file a complaint. Sometimes they just need a little bit more guidance about how to submit a reasonable accommodation. We can help them out with that as well. So it just kind of depends. And it's always hard to say specifically, what types of calls we get all the time, they change so much. So it's hard to say like exactly what we would do in every situation because it's always so different. But really what we're trying to do if somebody's reporting possible discrimination is assessing whether a formal complaint needs to be submitted or not. And if applicable, the investigation will take place. SWFHC will assist individuals in compiling helpful information, such as a timeline of events, starting with the first contact you had with the person or entity you believe violated your rights, the locations of events, any people who were present where events occurred, any other people who might have information related to the complaint, and any other relevant documents. This is the same information that HUD would require from an individual if an individual goes directly through HUD and files the complaint themselves. This is the same information that they would require. HUD will provide the party against whom the complaint has been filed notice and an opportunity to respond to the allegations. And HUD may gather evidence in many ways, including interviewing parties and witnesses, getting documents, and inspecting properties. So it just all really depends on what the situation calls for. But these are just some of the things, if the complaint process kind of moves along, these are some of the things that may be required from the individual to provide, just because these are all things to strengthen what is going on, to strengthen the complaint itself. So then, we move on to potential conciliation or voluntary compliance, and this is on the end of HUD. Throughout the investigation, HUD will try to help the parties resolve the complaint through an agreement. Any agreement is voluntary. No party is required to accept an offer. If the parties agree, HUD will prepare an agreement for signature. Following a signed agreement, HUD will close the investigation and monitor compliance with the agreement. Depending on the authorities that apply to the complaint, HUD may resolve the investigation through a document called a conciliation agreement, voluntary compliance agreement, or both. And this is all information that can actually be found on the HUD website as well. They provide this to the public on their end. So really the goal is to just prepare individuals for how the process kind of moves along a little bit. And once again, this can be found on HUD.gov as well. But I wanted to provide everybody kind of a brief overview and just kind of talk a little bit through it. But these are all, when you submit a complaint, it doesn't just go into oblivion. It like really just, there are things that need to take place in order for that complaint to move forward. And it is important for us to, mention, as an organization, we are not attorneys. We are fair housing experts, but we're not attorneys. And sometimes, attorneys do need to get involved with situations. So it just kind of depends on what the individual specific situation is. But at the end of the day, the real call to action here is that if anybody is experiencing what they perceive to be housing discrimination, they're unsure, they need to call us so that we can guide them through the process. That's really just the call to action here, because if we're trying to get into all the nuisances of, trying to decipher what exactly could happen, it's so hard to say. And yeah, this is just a general overview of kind of what happens when you do submit a complaint, when you do file a complaint through HUD. So yeah. Yeah, I'm putting my information up on the screen there. Once again, I'm an education and outreach specialist. So my job really at the organization is to provide as much education on the Fair Housing Act to individuals as I can, and when we do provide that information, our goal is to really get individuals to understand their rights and responsibilities. And if they do feel that their rights are being violated, to contact us, and our enforcement department can assist them with that complaint. They can assist them in exercising their rights under the Fair Housing Act. So we do have the website there. Once again, I did mention that individuals are able to submit a form through our website. They're able to email us. If somebody emails me or calls me and I decide that they need to be referred to enforcement, I do that as well. So we have a bunch of different ways of contacting us. The pandemic did not stop our work. We're still working right now. And even though we're working from home, we are still providing all of our services to individuals. So, we are here for the public with any questions. We are here for other partnering organizations with any questions that they may have. So yeah, hopefully I didn't take up too much of the time, but there's just so much to talk about, and I like to talk. So, yeah.
No, I appreciate everything you said. I had a couple of questions and comments. The first thing I want to stress is how important volunteering to be a tester is, especially minority and diverse testers, right? The whole purpose of a tester is to see how the company, the landlord, whoever they're testing treats other people, right? So if it's only one group who's volunteering for testers, you might not be able to uncover discrimination. So I remember in college or in my law school, there was an opportunity to become testers, and I wasn't able to do it, but I definitely wanted to, just because of getting that experience and just providing that resource. And one of the things that you said is how important it is just to reach out and let an organization like you or us know. It's one of those things where we can't be in the whole state. So it's another thing too, where sometimes you might not know if there's discrimination, right? If it's only happening to you, but we have information that's happening to other people, that builds a stronger case. So one of the things I say about housing is sometimes, unless the person is stupid as in how they're going to discriminate you and just be point blank about it, it's going to be hard to uncover that. But sometimes there is that gut feeling, right? That something feels off. They were okay on the phone when I was talking to them, but then when I saw them showing me the apartment or the house, they started acting differently. It's kind of that gut feeling that something's off. And even if it might not be discrimination, it's still worth reaching out to you all, reaching out to us, just so that information is there. And we'll be able to, if need to, take a case, because housing discrimination is one of those things where it can be as micro as a bad landlord, or it can be as macro as a very complex scheme. And one of the things, Tasha, you might be able to talk about being enforcement, is landlords and bigger conglomerates and even lenders are lawyered up to the T, that they want to make sure what they're doing isn't an open eye to discrimination. And I'm not saying all of them are doing it in bad faith, but they have complex ways where you need to chip through some layers to find that discrimination. Have you had an experience with that type of covering up, I should say?
I guess, yes, and simply that if someone happens to be a small independent landlord, it's probably actually a lot easier to identify the housing the discrimination actions. It's these larger companies that, know what they're doing. They have attorneys, they know the law, and they know how to at least try to get around it. But I think that's where, the testing comes in, because if we can show patterns of practice, it's going to really help, support someone's claim of discrimination, as well as just make it more clear and apparent. But yeah, for us on the enforcement level, we kind of look at things two different ways, isolated incidents of housing discrimination that occur at the property level, versus then taking that out to this bigger picture of, what is this property management company doing on a systemic level. But certainly, again, if someone's filing a fair housing complaint, I feel as though, as you mentioned, most of these companies are totally lawyered up. So reaching out to us as a resource when you're filing a fair housing complaint is so essential, because that's what if someone just goes and files a complaint at the Attorney General's office, it's them in a room with a neutral investigator and a team of attorneys. And so, it's very difficult to be successful, without an organization like ours or yours, or, someone there to help assist you and guide you through that process.
You said that 100% perfectly, right? We are advocates on behalf of them, right? HUD, the Attorney General, they're more of neutral fact finders. And if there is something wrong, they have, powers. The state could even bring a case if it gets egregious and they believe it. But they're there first as a fact finder, right? Here, if we agree to one of us to take you on, we're advocating on your behalf. So I definitely have the best defense and offense going into those meetings. The other thing I would like to mention, we kind of talked about this before we started, Laura, is reasonable accommodation. In our employment, the calls that we get about employment are always about, hey, I would like to have, an hour off for Friday to go pray, or I want to wear my hijab here, and my, just reasonable accommodations. I'm fasting. Can I switch my shift? We were talking about how reasonable accommodation is also something in fair housing. Do you mind mentioning that a little bit, Laura?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, individuals that do have disabilities, or, We're we're talking specifically
It's a
about
little
housing
bit
here.
different, but yeah, disability.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
but
meant to say disability.
oh, no, no worries. But it's really the same thought
Yeah.
process. Individuals with disabilities, in order for them to have equal and fair access to their housing, they do need certain things and they have the right to certain things. And those two things are reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. So a reasonable accommodation can be any change to the practices, the rules, the policies of the apartment complex or the dwelling, that an individual might need to have changed in order for them to once again have equal and fair access to their housing. And then the reasonable modification is any change to the physical environment of the dwelling. So some examples of both. Reasonable modification can be as simple as a wheelchair ramp for an individual, that requires it. Something like a reasonable accommodation, it does get a little bit more nuisance. It does get a little bit more complicated, and it's so important for providers to take those kind of on a case-by-case basis. But a good example of one would be something like a qualified animal, or if you want to call it a reasonable an emotional support animal, whatever you want to call them. Individuals with a disability, they do have a right to their animal, and they fall under the category of a reasonable accommodation. So say an apartment complex has a no pet policy, they do have to make a reasonable accommodation for the animal, because a qualified animal is not a pet. It's important to view something like a qualified animal that is assisting an individual with a disability as a very fuzzy wheelchair. That's kind of like how I try to really look at them, right? So once again, accommodations and modifications, they can range from a bunch of different things, because an individual with a disability, no disability is the same. No disability is always common or easily understood. So it's important that we're always taking it on a case-by-case basis. But ultimately, individuals with a disability, they have the right to a reasonable accommodation, or to many reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications that they may need in order to, really have that access to their housing. And the reason that we have this, and the reason that disability is a protected class, is because individuals with disabilities, they are subject to a lot of different taboo stereotypes. There's a lot of reasons. And the same way that disabilities are protected from like the ADA and things like employment, et cetera, it was so crucial for it to also be included in housing as well.
And one thing there, I'm going to stress the same thing as I stressed in employment. You have to ask. And sometimes if you're dealing with someone who just doesn't want to do it, they might try to brush it off. Like, are you serious? This is going to cost us so much money. And until they come back with like an official, whatever the reason is, they have to, it's that burden shift, right? You ask for that accommodation, they have to come back and say, well, this isn't reasonable, or we can't provide this because of X, right? And sometimes because it's something as crucial as this is where I live, and this person might try to make living harder for me. One thing you talked about is retaliation, right? So retaliation is all about, if they're going to make it harder, whatever it is, by you trying to use one of your housing rights, that's a whole separate charge. So they're getting in trouble twice, kind of, almost. But sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, and on the mention of retaliation, I think that fear of retaliation is something that really prevents most individuals from really coming forward. And the reason for that, as an advocate, we can understand that the fear of losing your housing or being displaced, we completely understand that it's a very understandable thing. But it is also important that the Fair Housing Act does protect individuals against retaliation. Providers cannot take any sort of negative action against an individual who is simply trying to exercise their rights under the Fair Housing Act. So, as an advocate, I really stress that. Retaliation, it is still, something that cannot be done under the Fair Housing Act. So when individuals are afraid that their provider will take any sort of retaliatory action against them, they are protected, and that's always important to note as well.
We say that CAIR is here to defend, educate, and empower our community. And I think same thing with you guys, it's that empower component that kind of gives people the strength to not fear retaliation. If you know that you have organizations that are here for you and that can have your back if there is retaliation, then I see you taking the decision of, I'm going to report this, or I'm going to make that stand for my rights. And it goes back to looking back on how the Fair Housing Act was first started, right? There were people who didn't have fair housing rights. I believe just 2 years ago it was 50 years, right? Or two years ago was the 50-year anniversary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a couple years before that. But before that, I mean, we're talking about, one parent, or even a grandparent's away of generation where they didn't have the right to have no discrimination. And it's kind of like, because they fought for us to get here, we have to make sure to fight for our next generation. And it can be as simple as, even if you don't want to bring that case, at least give us the information, at least tell us, so we could take that stand and advocate on your behalf. But one of the things you said is, if you have that opportunity to go ahead and go for it, and if it is a real and egregious case, then you want to help your community, and it's sometimes worth those couple bumps in the road. But definitely retaliation is the sword against someone, an overzealous landlord or an overzealous person. I always say, have it in paper, have it in writing, right? So you're going to ask a reasonable accommodation, and you might be, your landlord, and you might just like text him. Obviously he's writing, but I wouldn't do it. Hey, go over to his office, send that email, make sure he responds an email. And in Arizona, at least, you can record conversations. So if you do go into that person's office and ask for it, and they say something, bring your cell phone, record it. That's proof, right? Because another aspect, it's a little bit easier to prove they're not providing a reasonable accommodation because of X. But if they try to change the reasoning or whatever, you want to have that documentation. That's a crucial. Go ahead.
And I'm sorry, just really quickly on reasonable accommodations and modifications, something that when we are providing education for providers as to how they should deal with reasonable accommodations and modifications, I also really like to stress this interactive process, but that interactive process doesn't just go to the provider, it comes down to our consumers as well, and it kind of goes down to that, if we want these reasonable accommodations, these reasonable modifications, we also have to interact with the provider as well. Because
100%.
Once again, we have to go with that understanding too, that, not our disability, and disabilities in general are not always common or easily understood. And not every single provider, is not wanting to provide that. They may just not necessarily understand or know to provide you with the accommodation or modification. So that interactive process, it really goes both ways. And I think that's something that, I also like to stress, as consumers, we have those rights, so we need to exercise them and exercise them actively, not just passively.
Like you said, the first word is reasonable. So definitely you can't have all the accommodations, but things become more reasonable if more people, if it seems that if more people say that, hey, I have this issue, bring it up, it becomes more reasonable. Those are the points that I wanted to reiterate. I don't know if you guys have any other things before we finish up.
Not at this moment. I think on my end, I'm always just trying to empower individuals. We are here to help, so especially now with the pandemic and everything, I think it's even more important to really speak out against, the things that are happening. And at the very least, I'm always here, from other partners or even consumers, I'm always here to chat. So if an individual has any concerns about different things, because the Fair Housing Act covers more than just individual experiences or communities, right? We're also talking about things like zoning. We're talking about much bigger things as well. So I'm always here to chat if anybody wants to have a discussion about that. And I'm always here to collaborate as well.
Awesome. One last thing. Sorry, Tasha, I'll let you go.
Oh, I was just going to say on my end, it would just be to keep reiterating that call for testers. And then I believe Laura did touch on it, but these are paid positions for us. So you will get reimbursed for your time. And, right now during the pandemic, we've developed ways to also do all that virtually. So if, a concern of that, safety was there, we, for right now, at least, we're not doing them in person or anything. So, just a couple more things someone might be considering.
Definitely. And the testing opportunities are on your guys' website, correct? Or?
Yes, they are. We do have our interest form there, and somebody will be in touch. And, we are scheduling our tester trainings pretty often here, and they are done remotely. So right now it's just very accessible. Anybody from the state of Arizona can apply to be a tester and be paid for their time as well.
Awesome, awesome. The only last thing I was going to mention was first that the Fair Housing Act also has a hate crime component too. So, if you see all the times about examples of people's like houses getting vandalized with racist type, pictures or whatever, that's included under the Fair Housing Act. It's included in other stuff, but the Fair Housing Act is just another weapon to use to use your rights. But the other thing too is the Fair Housing Act also includes post-acquisition rights, and we're not going to be able to talk about them now, but your rights don't end. One of the things we see is a historical example is people not being able to use the amenities that are meant for the community, right? You always think about segregation in pools in the community, but maybe it's something as a community lounge or something like that. So fair housing doesn't stop right when you get into the house. It includes after that too. But I just want to say thank you all so much. And the most important thing that we've all said, but it's definitely worth repeating, is if you feel that you've been discriminated, even if you don't know, reach out to the Southwest Fair Housing Council, Southwest Fair Housing Council. But also we're here too as CAIR-Arizona because of our generous donors. We offer pro bono legal representation, but I'm the only attorney, so it's not that we have abundance of resources, but still, if we can't help you, and if the Southwest Fair Housing Council can't help you file a complaint, we'll be able to at least provide you the resources to get help. And at the minimum, you give us more information about what's happening in our state, right? Arizona is a huge state, and you saw Colorado City, which, without maybe, I don't know exactly how that case, someone found that case, but I didn't even know there was a Colorado City in Arizona. So that just shows you how there's discrimination happening from the north to the south to the east to the west, and without reporting it, there's not a way to end this battle. So I want to thank you both so much for this. And like I said, I'll have the contact information in the description too. And thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.